Well, hello, and welcome to today's Charleston Conference webcast. This is the Cambridge Journals Digital Archive from 1770 to 2018, sponsored by Cambridge University Press. Obviously, I'm not Leah Hines, as the name on the screen might suggest. My name is Matthew Ismail. I'm the Director of Collection Development at Central Michigan University, the editor of the Charleston briefings, and a conference director at the Charleston Conference. And we're glad you'll join us today. And I'm just filling in for Leah, who needed to be off for today. This webcast is being recorded, and the video and slides will be made available on the conference website soon, and a link will be sent to all registered attendees when it's available. Now, please hold all questions until the end of the presentation. You can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your question there at any time during the presentation. But those will be put in a queue for the panel to address at the end of the session. All right, now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today, two of whom are in Cambridge. And we're joined by three terrific panelists from Cambridge University Press, and I'll introduce them in the order they'll be speaking. Gavin Swanson, the Editorial Development Manager, has over 30 years experience in academic publishing after a brief career as a research scientist. He spent almost 20 years with Cambridge University Press prior to having worked briefly for Elsevier. His primary interests are in STEM, neuroscience, and developmental biology, but he now covers all subjects. Amongst other duties, Gavin manages and oversees the journal's archives creation, having first proposed that the press create one in 2007. The first collection was published in 2009, followed by annual collections since then. One of the most satisfying aspects of Gavin's job is being able finally to track down a missing issue that complete the archive of a journal, and simply adding to the historical output for further use in a modern medium. Avouris is the executive publisher of journals. She has over 15 years experience in the publishing industry, working with both corporate and not-for-profit publishers. After beginning her academic publishing career at Springer, where she was ultimately responsible for the US book and journal program in neuroscience, and moved to Cambridge in 2013, where she is now responsible for the growing and developing the Psychiatry and Psychology journals list. In addition to journals management, Anne has worked with authors and societies to develop ebook series, online handbooks, and reference works. And Jamie McIntyre is the Senior Commissioning Editor for Humanities and Social Science Journals at Cambridge University Press. He joined Cambridge in 2010 after a spell as a postdoctoral researcher in classics. He's responsible for journals across the humanities and social sciences list and leads on the classics and archaeology titles. Thanks to all of you for presenting today. And now I'll turn it over to Gavin.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity to present this webcast, and hello from across the pond. The first slide, get rid of my name and the title. Sorry, small technical issue there. There we go. Just give some data on the journal's digital archive. I probably won't go through all of these bullet points, but and you can read them at your leisure. But I'll give some of the background data on the archive. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I first proposed it around about 2007, mainly because some of the other bigger publishers already had an archive, and I thought it was about time that Cambridge also produced one. so I was given the jolly task of creating it, setting up and making it work. So in the intervening 18 months or so, managed to collect the content for over 180 titles, and we published the first package for sale in 2009. Since then, we've added more packages annually, and now have well over 480 journals listed on in the archive today. Not so many in subsequent years. We're publishing an average about 25 new titles. That doesn't always match the number of journals we acquire, because some of the journals have previous titles, maybe 2 or 3 or even 4 in some cases. The oldest journal goes back to 1770, Archaeology. That was a really nice one to handle, because we got all of the copies, and some of the early issues were really well bound, nice hand printed paper, and Jamie will talk a little bit about these later on. Our largest one is the online proceedings of the library of the Material Research Society. There's over about 500,000 pages and 65,000 articles. That was a big one to handle and process in a relatively short space of time. Currently, the archive occupies between 75 and 80% of the total number of journal articles on core. And it generates probably about 25 to 30% of the usage over the year. And there's roughly equal numbers of articles in STEM and HSS, and slightly larger proportion of journal titles in humanities and social sciences. Yep, next slide. So this slide looks slightly weird, and I'm hoping it's going to work. I prepared it a few years ago to give a visual impression of the extent of the archive compared to the whole of the articles on Cambridge Core. So each line, you'll not be able to read any of the text on this, but each horizontal line in blue gives the extent of an individual journal archive in terms of years. So the one at the very top is for Archaeology, starting in 1770 and extending shortly after, I think, 1990 or something. The vertical line towards the right represents 1997, which is when we first launched our own online publishing platform, Cambridge Journals Online. I've placed that as a kind of mark holder to show you roughly where the different relative dates are. You can see that not all of the archives extend up to the present day. That's because, as I said, mentioned earlier, some journals are previous titles of existing ones. But if you look at the overall percentage of area covered by the blue, that gives a good impression of the volume of content occupied by the archive in the current core holdings. Next slide. So you might be interested in how we prepare this. It's pretty much as other publishers do. We create PDFs from scanned copies and add an overlay of OCR to allow text searching and mining. We also provide what we term as headers and references. So XML files are created to provide HTML for publication. Headers being the journal articles, the author's names, contact details, the abstract, keywords, and so on. The basic bibliographical information that is provided for free, and also the references in the article. We took an early decision to include cited references, which at the time not many publishers had been including, and thankfully they now do, because we viewed that as an important part of the content, particularly for following references through the trails and so on. All of the references do have outward links where we can create them, usually via Google or Crossref, PubMed and NASA ADS for the relevant subject areas, and a few other niche databases. So hopefully that anyone using the archive can actually jump out, as they do with current content, onto the cited references and have access to them if they have subscriptions. More often than not nowadays, though, when we acquire a new journal from another publisher, they might already have created the archives. And so we usually can reuse the PDFs. Sometimes we have to create new ones if the files have been corrupted and so on, but PDF transfer is relatively straightforward nowadays. Converting the underlying XML or HTML, we can sometimes do that for perhaps the previous 4 or 5 years, but anything beyond that is usually not cost effective because the file formats, the DTDs, change quite often. It's the same with us. We've probably got about 12 different DTDs stretching all the way back to 1997. So it's usually more cost effective to create the headers and the reference files just by rekeying from scratch. We also cover, scan from cover to cover, again, which not many other publishers used to do, partly because, sometimes the covers are very useful and nice images, but the front matter and back matter, often, particularly with the older archives, include some very useful and interesting society notes or other things which might be classed as ephemera, but I'm sure are a goldmine for social studies and history of particular societies and so on. I'll go on to my final slide. Yes, the final one. Some of the challenges that we've encountered in creating these archives, most obvious one is usually missing issues. In common with most publishers way back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, we ourselves didn't actually keep many copies of journal issues that we sent out, usually preferring to use the print subscribers as a kind of distributed archive and database, not even thinking way back in the 50s and 60s about online digitization and so on. However, one of our some very senior directors at the press, I think in the 80s and 90s, did start to collect journal content, journal issues. So we actually had quite a good base to start from when I first started this project in 2007. However, I've had to manage to try and track down either complete runs of journals or missing issues since then. And we rely on a large number of different potential sources. Obviously, the societies themselves quite often include a full run of their issues or near full run, so we generally borrow them from them. Book dealers online, or even some local ones. I know a few local antiquarian book dealers, and in fact, Geological Magazine, one of the very first journals included in the first package, I just happened to know, fortuitously, that a local dealer had a full run. So I just called him up and said, "Do you still have it?" And he said yes, and so we bought it. He delivered it within 20 minutes, about an hour, carefully packaged up in about 40 different boxes. So that was a very satisfying first start. Some of the other challenges we have are with tight bindings, and there's an illustration here of one of them for History of Education Quarterly. Librarians, as you want, you quite often commonly put the 4 or 5 issues or 6 issues in the year into a single binding. Now, sometimes the binders are either overzealous or the actual printing didn't leave very much in the way of gutters or margins. And so stitches encroached onto the text block. So in this image at the top, you can see on the right-hand side, the stitching is actually encroached onto text block by a little bit. And although it's legible and readable as a human holding the copy in your hand, for scanning purposes, this was not ideal. And quite often with very thick volumes, maybe 12 issues in one thick bound volume, the curvature just wasn't able to be accommodated from the scanning. So in these cases, we disbind the volumes, taking out the stitches very carefully. We have a very, very good local binder who does that. We then send the individual sheets off for scanning. And when that's completed, we get them back again. And the binder painstakingly, using the same holes, restitches the volumes and reuses the original cases. So if we have to return them to the original source, they're quite often in much better condition than when we received them. Thankfully, not very many copies are like that, but it's something we take pains to do. Some of the other things we've come across are things like microfiche, CDs of recordings, sound files, particularly for some of the music titles. Similarly with cassette tapes. So we just have those recorded and created as online files so that we can attach them to the relevant articles. And in the early days, particularly with geological journals, we came across some very big fold-out maps. I think the biggest one was probably equivalent to about A0, or maybe slightly bigger than that, in an old imperial equivalent size. So the scanners scanned sections and then stitched them together electronically to create one single file. And the last example I'll give is one of the challenges was volume numbering. When we first launched CJO, Cambridge Journals Online, the architecture at the time meant that we couldn't publish in the same journal multiple volume ones or multiple volume 1 issue ones and so on. We discovered this when we first started digitizing Geological Magazine, one of the journals I mentioned. So for the first 10 years, they published Geological Magazine from mid-1880s, I think it was. And then in year 11, they decided to call it New Series, and they published another 10 volumes, and then became 3rd series, and then 4th series, and then 5th series. And then in the middle of the 5th series, they reverted back to volume numbering. So the next issue became volume 57. So we had to reconstruct or redesign the architecture to accommodate multiple volume 1s under different series. And that was a bit of a challenge, but it actually helped improve the online platform at the time. So great for the archive for helping improve that. And ACH, Archaeology journal, Jamie will describe a similar situation that we had with that. So I think that's all I need to cover, give you a taste of what the archive has been about, the context behind it, and some of the interesting snippets that we've come across. And I'll pass over to Anne for her presentation.
Thank you so much, Gavin. Just going to bring up my presentation. One moment. So coming into this presentation, I had the understanding from my sales colleagues that our STM content is sometimes overlooked by librarians due to the overwhelming strength of our HSS program. But in fact, we have some very deep, very impressive STM archives as well, which I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive into today in talking about the actual content that makes up the package. I've picked out a few subject areas in particular where we felt that the longevity of the content was particularly strong, or which otherwise continue to make contributions to the study of science and medicine. Some of these will be journals that Gavin has already spoken about. So I'm starting with a deep dive into the mathematical proceedings of the Cambridge Philosophical Society. The Cambridge Philosophical Society itself was established in 1819, and this remains a very influential society today. The Mathematical Proceedings was launched in 1924. As you can see, the archive runs up through 1996, just before the launch of our online platform. And many eminent mathematicians have published in the journal over the years. The work is still very relevant today. As those on the line who work in mathematics will know, mathematics papers have extremely useful longevity compared to other STM disciplines because the theorems continue to be used. So generally the usage half-life for mathematics journals is 30+ years. So if you look at the total usage of papers in a math journal, more than 50% of that usage is papers more than 30 years old. Citations follow the same pattern, which is why mathematicians tend to disregard impact factors. And so for the mathematical proceedings, less than 4% of all citations to articles published in the journal are to articles published in the previous 2 years. So 96% of all citations to this journal do not feature in the regular impact factor calculation. Every year, the list of most used papers online in this journal is dominated by papers on the mathematical foundation of quantum mechanics that date back to the 1930s. Authors like Dirac, you can see here the note on exchange phenomena and the Thomas atom, which is the most downloaded article in the entire archive of the journal. Schrödinger also appears. The most cited archive material is this Penrose article, a generalized inverse for matrices, which appeared in 1955. And again, this archive runs through 1996. So the fact that these are the top downloaded and top cited papers in the archive really tells you something about the longevity of articles in the discipline. So next, Geological Magazine. Gavin spoke a lot about this earlier in terms of it being really sort of foundational to the creation of the Cambridge archive. The journal was established in 1864. It's one of the oldest and best known periodicals in earth sciences. It publishes original papers, review articles, rapid communications, discussions about all aspects of the geosciences, with an emphasis on geology, mineralogy, paleontology. It provides a niche for interdisciplinary papers on geology that can inform our understanding of global geological processes, as well as more interdisciplinary and wide-ranging studies on the fundamental principles of the earth sciences. Obviously, there have been huge advances in developments in these fields over the past, let's say, 150, 170 years since the journal was launched, but there's also significant value when considering climate change to being able to review observations that were published in the journal from 100, 150 years ago, based on firsthand accounts. The magazine today is read by geophysicists, by glaciologists in Antarctica trying to understand subglacial geology. So in that context, the scientific record stretching back to 1864 is particularly valuable. What do we know today that might have been observed in the past? What does that mean for our near future? There are also a lot of sort of foundational pieces published in the journal that just remain very interesting. For example, early publications about continental drift and the formation of the supercontinent. You can see this report here by Arthur Holmes, a very important person in the discipline. Interestingly, we found when going through this that the most downloaded archive material in Geological Magazine was actually obituaries of leaders in the field. So those are continuing to be read today. Most cited material was a 1911 article on pillow lavas, which certainly I want to read. Again, this archive runs through 1996, so the fact that this is the most cited article in the archive tells you something about the continued relevance of that today. The British Journal of Psychiatry is one that I'm particularly close to, having worked with them for the past few years in bringing their archive to the press. This was another very, very large archive, hundreds of thousands of pages that were converted and put on our platform, and in some case sourced and scanned for the very first time. Among the first few volumes of the journal and the first few issues of the journal ever published were some of the articles I'm going to speak about today. These had not been digitized and put online before the journal moved to Cambridge in 2018. So the British Journal of Psychiatry was formerly known as the Journal of Mental Science. Before that, it was known as the Asylum Journal of Mental Science. Before that, in its earliest incarnation, it was known as the Asylum Journal. It's currently one of the leading scientific publications in psychiatry worldwide. And because its archive extends back so far to 1853, you're able to trace through its pages, and even within the change in title itself of the journal, the evolution of the discipline within the UK, the history of mental health stigma, changing public attitudes towards psychiatric research and mental health issues, which I think is very useful whether you're a psychiatrist or whether you're a public historian. So as initially comprised, the journal was meant as a reader for those working in asylums, with more practical correspondence and information on political and legal developments within the UK, such as the Asylum Act of 1853, legal updates regarding the use of insanity pleas within the courts, sometimes heated correspondence on how best to maintain patience within the system, the introduction of progressive methods such as non-restraint and discontinuation of seclusion as a punishment for patients. Gradually, the journal shifted its focus towards the scientific basis of mental health concerns. And it's interesting, even in its earliest pages, you can see some of the challenges that current psychiatrists face, just in the difficulties of the profession, the stress of treating patients for diseases that are often incurable. Important records within the British Journal of Psychiatry archive, as with the other journals that we mentioned, include details of scientific meetings, articles and letters giving insights into leading figures of the time, such as Henry Maudsley, even profiles of patients. And one interesting thing to come out of my research into this archive is, though, the expected storyline is that methods and approaches become more progressive over time. In fact, the archives don't always support this. As one example, in 1914, 90% of patients in UK asylums had daily work, paid or unpaid, which was believed to help people build confidence and self-esteem. And today, employment experience is still considered valuable, but people with schizophrenia have only a 10% chance of being employed in the UK. Which is something that contemporary historians of psychiatry are looking at. The journal has been frequently cited in works on the history of UK psychiatry. It's the leading source for 19th and early 20th century records. For example, Claire Hilton, who is a historian of psychiatry, drew on records from this journal for a recent article she published called Psychiatry Past and Present, where she compared high death rates in World War I asylums from preventable secondary diseases like TB, dysentery, and typhoid to current rates of cardiovascular disease deaths among those with diagnoses of mental illnesses. And while 20th century theories had suspected that those with mental illnesses were predisposed to infections or were made more susceptible as a result of medication, she was able to draw a connection between that World War I experience as documented within the journal and the contemporary phenomenon, and hypothesized that neglect, underfunding, lack of support, austerity measures were in fact to blame. Again, you can see some of the most downloaded and archived material here, a little bit more recent, but still strong usage from the BJ Psych archive. The Journal of Paleontology publishes original articles and notes on phylogeny, paleoecology, paleogeography, evolution of fossil organisms. This was founded in 1964 as a Paleontological Society memoir. Our archive contains their supplemental publications from 1968 into 1986 and full issues available thereafter. The Journal of Paleobiology, also founded by the same society, is included in full from 1975, so I consider them together here. Both of these journals contain foundational work for leaders in the field. One highly downloaded article from 1992 by David Ropp, who was a leading founder of paleobiology as a discipline as well as the journal, discusses the then relatively new theory of an asteroid impact as the cause of the Cretaceous tertiary mass extinction. I particularly like the title of that article, which was Large Body Impact, the Least Unlikely Cause of Pulsed Extinction. Papers within these journals that describe newly discovered species also remain highly relevant, as well as taxonomic and classification articles. As you can see, the most downloaded article in the archive, which is also one of the most highly cited with well over 2,500 citations, and Byron-Meyer's taphonomic and ecologic information from bone weathering continues to inform current approaches. I wanted to just give one example of a sort of discovery paper that is that was included in the archive that I came across while doing the research for this, which is the discovery of a new species of Plesiosaurus. This was 1864. And these sorts of sort of more observational pieces are scattered throughout the archive, intermixed with updates from the field from people who, say, went walking in Australia and found a meteorite or a petrified forest. And we still see good usage of much of this content today. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jamie for the HSF archive.
Okay, thanks, Anne. I will just bring up my PowerPoint, which hopefully you will all be able to see. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our HSS archives, which to a certain extent, you know, as Anne has said with the STM archives, you expect that there will be a reasonable amount of usage, that our HSS, our humanities and social sciences archives will have a relative degree of longevity. It's not necessarily the case for all of our HSS archives, but I think it is broadly true across quite a number of our journals, particularly which the humanities titles, where there's perhaps a bit more of a qualitative or sort of literary approach to a variety of the disciplines that we're talking about. And discussions of certain topics can remain relevant despite their age and changes in methodological approaches. As Gavin has said, the oldest archive on Cambridge Core belongs to Archaeologia, which is a journal that belongs to the Society of Antiquaries of London, so antiquarian by name and antiquarian by nature in many respects, which published between 1770 and 1992, but which we still see making some degree of contribution to ongoing research. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and also about a couple of other journals such as Antiquity and the Journal of Hellenic Studies, in order to sort of briefly and somewhat superficially talk around 4 questions. How well read are our HSS archives? How much do they contribute to ongoing research in their disciplines? What new forms of research do archives support? And what can we learn about our communities? So to a certain extent, that touches on the sociological question that Gavin mentioned earlier on. So in a really brief and sort of hopefully digestible form, these are the raw numbers for Archaeologia in 2019. As you can see, what we had was 84 and a bit thousand article abstract views, which is a little bit of a misnomer in this case, because as Gavin well knows from digitizing the archive, much of our oldest content didn't have abstracts back in the day. So what we do is we actually digitize the first page of the article. Well, we digitize the whole thing, but we give the first page as a free preview for people to look at and understand if they want to read the article or not. So a lot of people coming to Archaeologia and looking at that abstract view, understanding what the journal publishes, which then goes on to around about 7,500 full text article downloads, roughly the same number of table of contents views, and then people clicking through from search results to about 3,000 times to come to content in Archaeologia. That's just the numbers for the year just passed. That's just for 2019. And And we still attract citations for Archaeologia as well. So the paper here, The Jutisch Style, A Study of Germanic Animal Arts, which came from 1961, is the most cited article in 2019, attracting a number of citations, which I haven't put on here, unfortunately, but it was not a huge number, but it was a relatively useful number of citations to understand that the journal is still picking up, is still being referred to in the current literature. This is a sort of a breakdown of the Archaeologia articles that were being read in 2019. So within that 7 and a bit thousand full text downloads, this is the top number of downloaded articles. Again, the numbers for each individual article are not necessarily huge, but cumulatively you do get that 7 and a bit thousand, and there will be a lot of articles where there are only a handful of downloads. But what I think is really interesting about this is the way that we see usage spread across articles dating right back to 1770. So I've highlighted 2 there from the first volume of Archaeologia, all the way through to papers into the final volume, 110, in 1992. The most downloaded being this paper on the etiquette and planning of state apartments and Baroque palaces, which I'll talk about in a moment, but some really interesting curios here as well. Directions to the book binder is not a set of where to find your local bindery, but is in fact a set of instructions to the binder on where to place the plates within that volume 5 of Archaeologia. You'll also notice that one of the most downloaded articles here is an erratum from 1841, but not the original article that it was referring to. But I think what's clear here as well is that within the Archaeologia archive, what we're looking at is reports of discoveries and sites which remain current or useful in some way, particularly when we're talking about something like the excavations in Cyprus, where a report on an excavation site from the time can be extremely valuable to archaeologists revisiting the site, revisiting the finds, and understanding the context in which those finds were made. So again, a lot of this material continuing to be very useful to readers in 2019. These are a list of the articles citing that top downloaded in 2019 article. And again, while we see quite a sort of variation there back to 1992, interestingly enough, the year that Archaeologia ceased publication. But what I think is really interesting is continuing to see some citations made to the journal much more recently. So in 2018 and 2017, interesting to see that this article being featured in an article or being cited in an article in the Scandinavian Journal of History. As Gavin referred to interest earlier, and as a sort of a sidebar, as Gavin said, we had to think about how we disambiguate multiple editions from archives. So Archaeologia's own volume 1 published twice, once in 1770 and once in 1779. And we had to find a way to make sure that those were both available on Cambridge Core or Cambridge Journals Online when they first published as an archive, but also had to make sure that both were preserved in their entirety. So not just preserving articles with the differences between them, but the entirety of both editions has been digitized and preserved through Cambridge Journals Online. And that's been done for a number of different journals in other cases. To look at the Journal of Hellenic Studies very briefly, now the most overall downloaded article in JHS in 2019, so that includes new and archive content, it's Tragic Form and Feeling in the Iliad by R.B. Rutherford from 1982. Interestingly enough, this quite often features in the most downloaded papers for JHS. It's a particular classic of tragic scholarship. And again, it continues to attract citations as well. So 37 citations listed in Web of Science, 44 in Scopus. Obviously, the two different systems don't track the exact same citations. And it has been cited in new articles every year since 2005, sometimes more than once, clearly. And that's, I think, also particularly interesting given that the Digital Archive didn't publish online until 2012. So we've seen an increase in the number of citations on a yearly basis to this article as well. To move to a journal which has a lot more activity in its current content, Antiquities current content is what dominates its most downloaded content. But what we have here is an article from its archive published in 1997, which still attracted 8,000 full text. So this is the most downloaded archive article from Antiquity, which is a journal that stretches back to 1927. And again, this is a journal, an article that is still attracting citations listed both through Web of Science, so 5 in 2019 of the 39 cured so far, 3 in 2019 from the 59. And of course, just to be absolutely clear, as you all know, HSS journals track citations in a very different way to much of our STM content. So while the numbers are never as high, they are, it is still a sort of a telling piece of information that these articles are still attracting citations. And again, speaking as a Romanist, this is a pretty classic article on demography and ancient Rome that has been particularly influential over the years. Looking at this from the other side, so an article from Antiquity from its very first edition in 1927 that is still attracting usage and downloads. We have this piece on the Danube thoroughfare and the beginnings of civilization in Europe by the very famous at the time V. Gordon Childs, which continues to attract downloads, 111 full text downloads in 2019, and again continues to attract citations because of its discussion still remaining relevant to archaeologists working in the Danube region to this day. So one thing, again, that's very useful as well is thinking about the insights that we might be able to gain into our communities from the archives that we have published online. We have a pretty broad policy on data mining here at Cambridge University Press, which is usually that data mining, that if you have the right to read, you have the right to data mine. So we want to support projects where we can. And in this instance, we were asked to support a project which allowed researchers to mine our published articles on Maya archaeology in a couple of journals using large-scale text mining approaches, such as topic modeling, word-to-vec, and metadata visualizations. The researchers making the application plan to use the results to examine culturally specific frameworks about objects and materiality, such as what explicit or implicit beliefs researchers have about the artifacts they work with, and how their specific perceptions of artifacts may impact the research that they carry out. And that's something that obviously can be tracked over time as well, looking at very earliest articles in the journals under study, which include Ancient Mesoamerica, which we featured here, through to current research. So we granted the researchers access to a batch data set of all transcribed full text articles in machine readable format in order to perform this analysis. And we're really excited to see what results they're going to come back with and which they promise to share with us. The other part of this is to think a little bit about, as Gavin said, the sociological part of some of our archives. As Gavin said, we took a really conscious decision that we would digitize everything from front matter to back matter, covers, adverts, the whole lot. And so what we find in the pages of many of our journals is adverts which give us an understanding of who they thought perhaps were reading the journals. So in this issue of, from an issue of the Journal of Hellenic Studies in 1967, while the rest of the world was listening to Sergeant Pepper, Barclays Bank was advertising in the pages of JHS to barristers who enjoyed Gilbert and Sullivan. And I think that tells us something about the structure of class and power in the UK at the time, the relative prevalence of a classical education in the sort of the powerful in this country. And it gives us information about the kind of things that they might have been interested in. Alongside that, we see perhaps more, intuitively an advertisement for Hellenic air cruises. But I think, as many of you will have browsed through journals, current editions, the advertising for toured holidays has certainly fallen off in most of the titles that we work with today. We even managed to see some familiar faces. This again, an advert from the 1950s in the Journal of Hellenic Studies, but also interestingly, many of these journals, as Gavin said, published in their front matter things such as council lists, lists of new members, which again gives us that insight into who was making decisions in their disciplines in sort of the past days for these societies. It preserves a record of where the power lay in the disciplines as they were forming and as they made their way into becoming modern scientific disciplines, even in the humanities. So Prof. E.R. Dodds here, the president of the Hellenic Studies Society, a very powerful and influential classicist whose name you will find on many books and within many journals. But very often, you will see honorary involvement from princes and such like across a number of our journals. And something, a bit of a curio as well, some of our journals sort of took a much more, their attitudes to their readership, particularly in the classicists, would be in some ways a bit more casual. And so we find in the pages of Greece and Rome, these Greek and Latin crosswords that they used to publish in every edition. These are from the 1930s. Again, I think it says something about the relative interests of the readership of these journals, who they thought they were aiming their journals at, not just a scholarly audience, but also an audience of perhaps more interested people who had a classical background. We actually published, well, we printed out some of these crosswords as marketing material and took them to some conferences. At which a number of scholars in classics really struggled to do them. I think it's not anything that I would take as a particularly important piece of information, but I think it's interesting to see how the relative levels of knowledge of Greek and Latin have changed even amongst the communities in which these journals are serving. And I think what's also very interesting is to get some insight when you look at the list of solutions that are received. We get these in the journal to see particular names cropping up very often. And sometimes I wonder that at the Ampleforth College, where Mr. Ellie Ayres was based, was perhaps not giving Ellie Ayres enough to do other than the Greek and Latin crosswords. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Anne to talk through a couple of examples from some of the journals she's been talking about.
So yes, I also wanted to pick out a couple of the advertisements that appeared in early issues of the British Journal of Psychiatry. These begin to disappear once the journal transitions into the Journal of Mental Science. But as I noted, the early issues of the journal were really circulated to those who were working actively in asylums, usually on site. And so the types of advertisements you see in the journal at that time are sort of classified ads for jobs at asylums, or furniture that might be suitable, or other things that you could buy to provide for your patients. Sometimes some of them a little bit more palatable than others, as you can see here. The first advertisement for the Asylum buckle. No picture, but this was something used apparently to keep clothing on patients. Jamie, could you advance the slide? Thank you. Also, in another issue of the Asylum Journal, as it had then been renamed the Asylum Journal of Mental Science, a bit later in the mid-19th century, a series of sort of testimonials that had been written under duress, let's say, from those who had been accused and convicted of putting patients into an asylum environment without apparently having had the proper paperwork. And so there's a series of these, the Queen against publications from those who were not allowed to apparently inter patients because they were not properly designated as surgeons within the journal. So particularly within this journal, you do see this sort of sociological information, as Jamie was saying, which tells you a lot about the environment in which the journal was operating. Again, the feelings, the public feelings around the treatment of the mentally ill at the time in mid-19th century United Kingdom, and also a lot about sort of legal developments regarding the treatment of patients, which is particularly invaluable for those who are studying the history of psychiatry, and which would be lost without the digitization of, you know, the front and back matter of the journals in which this is placed.
Okay, I thank you very much to all of the presenters today. I see a question in the Q&A section. Jamie mentioned if you have read rights, you have data mining rights, and that researchers can be granted access to mine data. I am not clear on whether there are additional costs associated with data mining CGDA or researchers and libraries.
I don't know that some of our other colleagues in the room might want to chip in here as well in the US, but my understanding of it is that if you have purchased access to the digital archive, then you have the rights to data mine the content, that you can perform projects, or your faculty can perform projects that they're interested in. I'm not entirely sure what the status is if you do not already have access to the archive, but in which case I would probably suggest speak to your local Cambridge reps and see what they say about the particular rights that your college has.
Okay. Another question, how did you disambiguate the multiple series within the title you discussed, and did this prove compatible with discovery systems?
It's a slightly complicated answer, but we did manage to do it through the metadata, particularly for the different issues and articles associated with them. We're in the middle of a big analysis to try and get the full digital archive compatible with the PIJ policies. So from about 2014, 2013, whenever we've come across previous titles of a current existing journal, we've created separate, effectively, homepages for each of those with their own ISSNs and so on. Prior to that, we had the view, and it was based largely on some feedback from librarians, I believe, that all of the previous titles, to an extent, volume, journal, should be accommodated within that, that journal's homepage. So perhaps a third, no, it's a little bit smaller than that. There's about, I think, 100 journal titles which currently exist underneath an existing title. And we're starting a project to see if we can separate out these prior titles and eventually have them existing under their own separate title, but always cross-linked and with the appropriate title history. But that's going to take a little bit of time to separate them out. And it should just be a one-off project for all of these titles. But that's in the works. So the next question I see is, why did publishers in the past not keep archives of their publications? Probably partly for space reasons. And I think that was partly the reason we did it, but also, as I mentioned in my sort of introduction there, they were never thinking about archival reasons for this. And certainly if they had hundreds, if not thousands of subscribers, if they quickly needed to get hold of a copy of an issue, I think the expectation was that they could either borrow it from a local library that subscribed, or certainly in the UK, the Copyright Library deposits, where we have to deposit copies of everything that we publish in 6 university libraries plus the British Library. Similar arrangements are there for the Library of Congress in the States, and I think we have some arrangements with Australian libraries as well. So it was probably not necessarily a lack of foresight or forward thinking. It was just the way it was done then. Yes. So images, because we chose just to provide PDFs and the header and reference material, mainly because it was going to be just not cost effective or just far too expensive to recreate the full text. Images only exist as part of the PDFs, and that was the way it was started out to be done. Whereas nowadays in front list, images are part of the full text, HTML or XML, and they can be presented separately. We haven't gone back to separate out the images from PDFs. Unfortunately, again, we don't have the full resources to be able to do that. Any other questions?
And if there are no other questions, I think we can probably wrap this up. So thank you very much to our panelists from Cambridge University Press, and thank you to the attendees for coming today.
Thanks for listening to us.
Thank you.
The recording will be available on the conference website. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Goodbye.
Bye.